In a forgotten corner of Rome, workers swear they saw a bronze mask still sizzling with heat, lying where no one had left it. Its expression was not fear, but furious refusal, as if the face it was taken from realized too late that the ancient foundry beneath the ruins had started hiring again. And when the ground exhaled, long, metallic, almost human, everyone understood the same horrifying truth. Something buried for over 1,000 years has resumed its work, and it only needs one thing to keep going. The ruins of Aurelian's ancient mint had waited longer than any living memory could grasp, crouched beneath layers of Roman dust that clung to the stones like a second skin. At dawn, when the excavators peeled back the earth that had sealed the site since the reign of an emperor whose name now tasted of iron and forgotten commands, the air changed with the subtlety of a held breath finally released. In that pale, hesitant morning, the first bronze mask emerged from the soil, yet instead of catching the newborn sunlight in a triumphant gleam, it seemed to swallow the light whole. Its features were not sculpted but captured, a face frozen in a moment of terror, so profound the hollows around the eyes looked burned rather than molded. The expression was neither theatrical nor exaggerated. It bore the cramped sincerity of a final, silent scream, the kind that leaves no trace except the imprint of dread on the muscle beneath the skin. Within hours, the earth surrendered more. Each mask surfaced like a relic unwilling to return to daylight, their edges dulled, their patina mottled with shadows that did not recede even when brushed clean. The pieces were nearly identical, as though the fear they carried had been standardized, pressed into bronze the way the old mint had once pressed emperors' profiles into coins. No artisan's hand could have reproduced terror with such mechanical precision, and the symmetry only deepened the unease among those who unearthed them. The air around the ruins thickened with a faint metallic tang, not sharp like blood, but warm, like bronze heated beyond comfort, yet still just below the point of softening. As the masks multiplied on the catalog tables, a restlessness crept through the dig site. The archaeologists felt it first as a shifting weight in the stillness, a sense that the ground beneath their feet was listening. The broken archways seemed to lean inward, the collapsed roof stones angled in postures that resembled curiosity rather than decay. Some workers complained of brief flickers in their periphery, glints of coppery light darting between broken columns or slipping across the dusty floor as though reflecting off something that was not present a heartbeat earlier. Others noticed a faint tremor underfoot, so subtle it might have been imagined, yet persistent enough to unsettle the mind. By late afternoon, the shadows that pooled inside the ruined mint felt denser than they should have, too cohesive for the hour. The masks on the tables seemed to shift their expressions imperceptibly under the changing light, not enough to confirm, only enough to erode certainty. The terror carved into them, once static, now hinted at motion, at recoil, as though they remembered something and strained silently against the bronze that kept them inert. A warm, near inaudible hum pulsed through the chamber at intervals, subtle, rhythmic, reminiscent of metal struck softly in ritual repetition. No one connected it at first. Not the archaeologists cataloging identical horrors. Not the supervisors noting unusual atmospheric readings. Not even the night watchmen who would later swear they heard a faint chiming echo from within the sealed earth just beyond the dig. Yet the mint, half exhumed and half dreaming, had already begun to stir. And the bronze faces lying exposed to the Roman sun seemed to wait with a patience that did not belong to anything crafted by human hands. The night that followed the discovery did not descend gently upon the district. It folded over the streets like a sheet of hammered bronze, its weight too dense, its quiet too intentional. The alleys near the ruins of the old mint seemed to constrict, drawing their shadows inward as though bracing for a presence that preferred narrow places. The first metallic sound drifted through this hush with a delicacy that felt almost mocking, a thin, clean strike, as if a sliver of moonlight had collided with stone. It did not ring like the uneven clatter of a craftsman's tools. It pulsed with a measured rhythm, too precise to be human, too patient to belong to anything that remembered fatigue. The tone lingered unnaturally in the air, refusing to fade, as though some unseen chamber were amplifying it from a depth untouched by centuries of collapse. Residents woke in stages, roused not by loudness but by wrongness. The sound threaded itself through shutters, seeped beneath doors, and curled across bedroom floors with the cautious curiosity of a creature sniffing the unfamiliar. People sat up in their beds with the strange conviction that the noise had been meant for them alone, a private calling, a summons delivered in a language stripped of all warmth. The more superstitious whispered silent prayers, but even the devout felt their words falter, as though the air refused to carry them. Something was claiming the night with the authority of an inheritance. The wind did not stir. Not a single vine along the crumbling walls shifted, not a grain of dust spiraled upward. And yet the ringing continued, steady as a heartbeat that had never belonged to flesh. Strangely, it did not echo. It moved with eerie purpose, weaving through the district in a slow circuit, probing one alley, then another, mapping the spaces as if reacquainting itself with an old blueprint. Those brave enough to peer through window cracks saw nothing but darkness pooled in the streets, undisturbed, thick as cooled metal. Yet every ear insisted there was movement, light, deliberate movement, beneath that blanket of stillness. At the center of the unease stood the ruins, their silhouette rigid and innocent in the moonlight. But the ground surrounding them carried a tense vibration, a faint tremor that could be felt more easily in bone than in soil. It was as though the earth remembered a rhythm that human memory had long discarded. Some swore a dim glow leaked between the ancient stones, a subtle shimmer like heat rising from a furnace banked but not extinguished. Others claimed the shadows at the entrance drew themselves inward, tightening into a shape that was not cast by any visible stone. The metallic ringing deepened as the hours passed, gaining layers like overlapping breaths. A second tone emerged, lower and slower, complementing the first with unnerving harmony. Together they formed a cadence reminiscent of long-ago labor, the kind that once defined the heartbeat of an empire. Hammer, die, strike, release. But now the pattern felt stripped of human imperfection. There were no hesitations, no variations, no grit in the movement. Only a cold, meticulous perseverance that suggested the rhythm itself had become sentient, obeying its own memory rather than a craftsman-esque command. Stranger still was the warmth. By the hour before dawn, the air near the ruins thickened with a heat inconsistent with the season, a dense, smelting warmth that settled on the skin like invisible ash. It clung to passers-by, soaking their clothes with the faint scent of aged copper. Those who ventured too close felt their breath grow shallow, as though the atmosphere around the mint demanded a toll for entry. Some staggered away with the disturbing impression that something had pressed gently against their chest, a soft but insistent weight, testing the resistance of flesh. Animals refused to cross the boundary of the site. Stray dogs halted mid-stride, hackles rising, eyes fixed on the darkness with the grim recognition of creatures that still remembered the scent of predators long extinct. Birds avoided the rooftops closest to the ruins, wheeling away with abrupt, silent panic as if repelled by a gust too subtle for humans to detect. Even the insects seemed to vanish, leaving the air unnervingly sterile, as though nature itself refused to intrude upon whatever mechanism had begun to stir. As dawn finally rolled over the rooftops, the ringing faded not gradually, but with abrupt precision, stopping mid-strike, as if an unseen supervisor had raised a hand and brought the shift to an end. The warmth dissipated instantly. The district exhaled as though freed from a tightening grip. Yet the silence that followed was not relief. It was expectation, the kind that chills rather than comforts. The people of the quarter stepped into the new daylight with the uneasy certainty that the night had not been a haunting, but a rehearsal. Something beneath the ruined mint had awakened to the memory of its own purpose, and what had begun with a single metallic whisper would not end with dawn. The clay yielded slowly, as if reluctant to release what had been entombed beneath it for more than a millennium, and yet by the pale light of early excavation the channels emerged in a broken lattice of hardened earth. They ran like veins across the ground, twisting and converging with a purpose that no ordinary workshop truly required, and the residue lining their walls still bore a faint, oily sheen, the ghost of metal that had once flowed through them in incandescent torrents. Upon those walls, the archaeologists found the marks that silenced even the most talkative among them, elongated impressions of hands, fingers splayed in rigid desperation, pressed deep into the clay as though flesh had burned itself into the earth in a final, frantic appeal for escape. The gestures were unmistakable. They did not speak of ritual, nor of accident, but of beings driven into these channels not by duty, but by terror. When the teams lifted the first of the half-buried tools, a low groan traveled through the soil underfoot, so soft it might have been imagination, yet too localized to dismiss. The chisels and forms were twisted at disquieting angles, contorted like bones subjected to impossible torque. Some bored deep indentations along their handles, as though something heavy had been forced against them, crushing wood and metal alike under unimaginable strain. Others were bent inward, folded almost tenderly upon themselves, as though the tools had tried to protect their own shapes from whatever violence had visited them. The archaeologists catalogued each piece meticulously, but the usual air of professional detachment evaporated with every new discovery. These instruments had not simply been abandoned. They had been broken in ways that defied logical reconstruction, as if the final moments of the mint had unfolded under conditions that no human mind would willingly entertain. Below the largest channel, where clay had once been baked by intense heat, they found the first cluster of masks still fused to the impressions of casting trays. The trays themselves had cracked into jagged fragments, but the masks, bronze faces frozen in that same universal rictus of horror, seemed almost fresh despite their burial. A faint warmth clung to them, a trace so subtle it could be mistaken for sunlight trapped in the metal, yet the sky above was clouded and gray. One of the archaeologists held a mask up to the light, and the thin layer of dust that coated it began to curl and lift as if repelled by an inner heat. Even the shadows in its eye sockets quivered, unwilling to remain still. The deeper they dug, the more the air thickened, acquiring a metallic tang that coated the tongue with the bitter memory of smelted ore. Several workers insisted that the channels seemed to hum faintly, a vibration beneath perception but strong enough to create a pressure in the sinuses, as though the ancient arteries beneath the earth were preparing to pulse again. The site foreman dismissed these concerns at first, attributing them to exhaustion, but by the time the sun reached its zenith, even he had begun to glance uneasily toward the ruined foundation of the mint. The stone slabs there appeared subtly misaligned, their edges no longer touching as cleanly as they had the previous day. It was as though the earth itself had shifted minutely, widening seams not through natural settling, but through some inward exhalation from the depths. At twilight, the masks took on a different quality altogether. Their bronze surfaces reflected the dying light with an almost liquid ripple, as though each face were coated in a thin film of molten metal that refused to cool. Many of the archaeologists had seen artifacts heated by ritual or disaster, yet this warmth was wrong. Focused, selective, pulsing not from the sun's remnants, but from within the metal itself. The expressions on the masks seemed to deepen with each passing minute, the carved terror sharpening into something more articulate, almost communicative. It felt less like the imprint of fear and more like its echo, preserved with such precision that it never truly faded. By nightfall, the wind carried the faintest suggestion of distant clanging, thin, metallic, unmistakably rhythmic, though no breeze stirred the surrounding olive trees. The sound emanated from the direction of the ruined mint, drifting above the trenches and equipment like a memory trying to reform itself in the present. The archaeologists tried to ignore it, tried to reason with themselves that the day's discoveries had unsettled their senses, but the truth pressed down on them like a gathering weight. The channels beneath their feet, once conduits for molten bronze, now felt like organs regaining function. And the masks, warm to the touch despite 1,000 years in cold earth, seemed to watch the living with an expectation that none dared to name. The rumors moved through Rome with the sluggish insistence of smoke creeping under a locked door, clinging to every whispered conversation until even those who had never approached the ruins felt, as though the bronze masks were watching them from the periphery of thought. By the time the fourth night arrived after the discovery, the old quarter surrounding the remains of Emperor Aurelian's mint had become a strange kind of pilgrimage site, drawing the curious, the superstitious, and the quietly terrified toward its fractured arches. They approached not out of bravery, but as if pulled by a thread buried somewhere in their ribs, a steady tug that grew stronger once the sun dipped behind the Tiber and the city surrendered to shadows. Those who stood nearest the surviving walls felt the air shift in a way that had no business occurring in the open. A dry, metallic heat pressed against their faces, faint yet oppressive, as though exhaled from a furnace kept alive by embers that should have died more than 1,000 years ago. The sensation was so specific, so precise in its temperature and its texture, that some instinctively wiped their cheeks afterward. Certain flecks of soot must have settled there. The metallic ringing had grown bolder with each passing dusk. What had been a tentative fluttering of sound, like a dropped coin skittering across stone, evolved into a rhythm that carried a dreadful confidence. It no longer drifted randomly across the alleyways. It beat with a structured cadence, the kind of steady cycle once produced by rows of laborers striking dies in perfect unison. Yet this new resonance lacked human imperfection. There were no pauses, no falterings, no uneven tensions in the reverberation. Instead, the unseen forge worked with the precision of a mechanism that did not tire, a device driven by something older and far more patient than muscle and bone. The clangs rolled out in sequences of rising force, then settled into softer, rasping sweeps as though molten metal were being poured, shaped, cooled. An entire workshop resurrected in darkness without the courtesy of bodies to man it. Those who had grown up hearing legends of Aurelian's mint began to remember details they had once dismissed as embellished folklore. It resurfaced in their minds with an eerie clarity, as if the stories themselves had been waiting beneath dust, ready to return with new, sharpened edges. People recalled the tales of prisoners forced into the emperor's service, of artisans worked until their hands trembled too violently to hold their tools, of nights where the mint glowed like a blister on the city's surface, fed by fires that refused to dim. The empire had demanded perfection from its coinage, and rumors claimed that Aurelian's overseers cared little whether that perfection was achieved by technique or by fear. Workers supposedly locked inside the mint for days, their garments stiff with sweat and soot, had spoken of hearing cries from behind sealed chambers, please, then silence, then the unmistakable shriek of metal poured where flesh should never meet liquid bronze. These memories, long left dormant in Rome's collective consciousness, now rose like bruises through thin skin. The modern residents found themselves dwelling on the oppressive nature of the old emperor's ambition, recognizing in the steady nighttime clangor a kind of historical echo, a reminder that empires were fashioned not merely from marble and legislation, but from exhausted bodies pressed to the limit of utility. It became increasingly difficult to dismiss the sounds as the city settling or as clever pranks engineered by opportunists. There was no wind rustling through the olive branches, no stray cats darting between stones, no machinery nearby that could mimic the uncanny precision of the mint's phantom labor. And always, in the charged stillness between each hammer-like strike, there lingered a quivering dryness in the air, a breath of heat that curled against the skin exactly like the exhalation of a dying furnace coaxed back into reluctant life. Some onlookers confessed privately that they sensed movement behind the cracked facade, not a figure or a shape, but a shifting pressure, an inward swelling of presence, as though the darkness itself were inhaling their attention and imprinting it upon something unseen. One elderly man claimed that when he leaned close enough to the wall, he could hear more than ringing. He could detect the faint scrape of metal against bone, a sound so specific in its awfulness that he could not sleep afterward. Others insisted they saw the dust at their feet tremble in patterns, forming brief semicircles like the impressions of masks pressing forward from beneath the earth. Rome, a city accustomed to carrying its past like a second architecture, now found itself staring at a wound that refused to remain sealed. The mint's history, once relegated to books and idle tales, seemed to stretch upward through time, cracking the surface of the present in thin, fiery lines. And in those lines, in those vibrations of unseen labor returning with renewed hunger, lay the growing certainty that the bronze masks were not relics of horrors completed, but warnings of a process rekindled, one that had unfinished tasks waiting in the dark. The bronze plate lay between their hands like an exposed nerve, trembling faintly from the vibration that had pulsed up through the soil as though the earth itself had struck a hammer against its own spine. Its surface, now cleared of dirt and centuries of oxidation, breathed with a dull, feverish glow, as if the metal retained a memory of heat that no passing millennium had managed to extinguish. The concentric rings carved into it seemed to tighten the longer one looked, pulling the gaze inward toward the tiny, burned hollow at the center, a wound so precise that it appeared less engraved than cauterized. The archaeologists gathered around the slab felt a prickle along their forearms, a sensation reminiscent of standing too close to a fire that had not yet decided whether it meant to warm or consume. It was a map in form, but not in purpose. It charted no terrain of Rome, no buried aqueducts, no forgotten temples. It described instead a pattern of motion, a rhythm, a center of pressure, as though recording the pulsing of some ancient furnace heart. They scarcely had time to interpret the etched grooves before another metallic strike rose beneath their feet. It was sharper than the previous ones, a blow that rang with the exactitude of a craftsman who had, at last, aligned his tools. The ground shivered, not violently, but with the unsettling sensation of something stirring directly underneath, close enough that the vibrations felt intimate, deliberate. Dust sifted from the edges of the excavation trench, drifting down in slow spiraling motions, each particle catching what little light filtered through from the overcast sky above. In that muted brightness, the bronze plate vibrated minutely, its concentric rings shimmering like ripples running backward across a pond. The archaeologists exchanged glances, but no one dared voice the obvious thought forming in each mind. The plate was responding, not merely echoing the sound, but anticipating it, resonating with an unseen pulse rising through the earth. They lowered the slab onto a layer of linen, but even then it whispered faint heat into the fabric, as though retaining the warmth of an invisible forge. One of them traced a fingertip close to, but not touching, the central hollow. The air above it quivered, thin and strangely alive, as though the space itself had been disturbed by breath. The blow from below repeated, once, twice, then a third time, each impact spaced with the precision of an instrument marking time. It no longer resembled the haphazard ringing of loose metal or shifting stones. This was a pattern, a sequence, a cadence of labor. The archaeologists could feel the strikes in their teeth, the backs of their jaws, as if the sound were traveling through bone rather than air. A faint murmur spread through the trench as a fine metallic dust began to rise from between the stones. At first it looked like ordinary earth disturbed by the vibrations, but the motes glinted with a soft bronze sheen, catching the daylight in dull, flickering sparks. They drifted upward, not outward, rising in a thin column that wavered like smoke from a quenched fire. The dust curled above the bronze plate, gathering at its center, drawn inexorably toward the burned hollow. It hovered there, forming a tight ring that spun with slow deliberation, aligning itself with the etched circles beneath it. For a moment the plate seemed to deepen, as though the hollow were widening, preparing to receive whatever the dust was becoming. Another strike, this one so forceful the soil visibly jumped, snapped the archaeologists back into motion. They stumbled away from the plate, instinctively backing toward the edge of the trench. The sound reverberated through the city block, rattling nearby window shutters and sending a startled flock of pigeons bursting upward in a chaotic spiral. Somewhere beyond the ruins, a dog began to howl with the raw, pleading tone of an animal sensing a shift it could not comprehend. The dust above the plate spun faster, tightening into a filament that shimmered like drawn wire. It stretched downward, trembling, as if waiting for an answering movement from beneath the earth. The ground swelled slightly in the center of the excavation. not enough to break, but enough to reveal the steady upward pressure of something aligning itself, matching the spinning dust particle for particle, moment for moment. A heat began to radiate from the soil, not the dry warmth of sun-baked stone, but the controlled, deliberate heat of a hidden forge preparing its next casting. The archaeologists felt the air change, thicken, become heavy with the metallic tang of bronze in the first stage of liquefaction. Just before they fled the trench, the fifth strike sounded. It was not merely louder, it was decisive. A declaration. A confirmation that the unseen mechanism beneath Rome's ancient skin had awakened fully. The bronze plate sang in response, emitting a faint, impossible hum that made the linen beneath it smolder. And in that final moment before panic overtook reason, the archaeologists saw the dust form a perfect circle above the glowing hollow, as though marking the precise point where the next mask, yet uncast, yet unclaimed, was meant to be born. The silence that followed was so dense it felt almost sculpted, as if the air itself had been hammered into stillness by a force determined to erase every trace of labor that had echoed beneath the ruined floors. For the first time since the unearthing of the bronze masks, the quarter lay under a quiet so abrupt that even the stray dogs hesitated to breathe, their instincts catching on something the mind could not yet name. The bronze slab, placed among the masks in a gesture half born of caution and half of desperate pattern-seeking, reflected none of the surrounding torchlight. Instead, it seemed to absorb it, drinking each flicker until the metal looked not dull, but impossibly deep, like a surface meant to swallow more than illumination. It rested there without weight, without menace, yet every archaeologist who stepped back from it felt a pressure settle on their ribs, as though the stone dust in the air had suddenly learned how to tighten. That night, long after the work lights were extinguished and the gates chained, the entire neighborhood awoke at nearly the same breath of time. It was not the usual murmur of late revelers or the moan of wind cutting between ancient walls. It was a single, drawn-out exhalation that rose from beneath the earth with the authority of something that had waited far too long for acknowledgement. The sound began like a groan pushed through metal tubes, but it stretched into a tone that resembled grief forced into the rigidity of iron. Windows rattled despite the stillness outside, and dust drifted gently from ceilings that had survived earthquakes far more brutal than this strange, subterranean cry. The city, older than empires and stubborn against myth, listened with an unease that belonged to creatures and not to stones. At dawn the archaeologists returned, expecting perhaps a fallen scaffolding or a cracked support beam, anything that could provide the comfort of explanation. Instead, they found the excavation site arranged with a precision none of them would admit out loud. Every mask now lay turned toward the center of the platform, as if summoned to witness something. Their hollow eyes converged on a single shape resting in the thin film of morning frost. It had not been there the previous evening. No one disputed that. No one dared suggest otherwise. The mask at the center glowed with a residual heat the sun had not yet earned the strength to give, and the dirt beneath it steamed faintly, as if the earth had recoiled the moment it touched down. This mask bore no resemblance to the ancient ones beyond the bronze itself. Its surface was too smooth, too newly worked. The edges still carried the trembling softness of cooling metal, and its expression, unlike the standard terror fused into the others, was carved with a tension that made the throat constrict to behold it. The mouth, half-parted, strained against some invisible force not out of fear but refusal, as though the last act of the one whose face had been taken was an attempt to deny being claimed. The brows were drawn in desperate concentration, the cheeks rigid with an effort that felt almost audible. It was not a mask of someone who screamed. It was a mask of someone who resisted until breath itself became molten. A sickly warmth radiated from it, carrying the unmistakable scent of fresh casting, burnt clay, scorched bronze, and the thin, acidic note of human sweat evaporated by unbearable heat. The artisans who once served in imperial foundries had written that bronze remembered touch, that it retained the imprint of whoever shaped it. If so, this mask remembered too much. On its inner surface, barely visible, lay a faint whorl, the kind that fingertips leave when pressed to pliable metal in the final instant before it hardens forever. It marked a moment that should not have been possible. The bronze slab nearby seemed changed as well. Its concentric lines, once dormant and unclear, now gleamed with a brightness that pulsed subtly, aligned with the slow cooling of the new mask. The small depression at the slab's center shimmered like a pupil adjusting to light. And though no sound broke the air, the tension of paused machinery emanated from the ground, a silence not of rest but of anticipation, the kind that settles only when labor is briefly halted, not ended. The workers stood motionless, unable to step closer, yet unable to retreat. They understood, each in their own reluctant way, that the rhythmic metallic ringing that had haunted the streets had not been a remnant of the past, but a summons toward completion. The unseen workshop below had been unfinished, unstaffed, awaiting a catalyst. And now, with the new mask cooling in the morning light, it had made its choice. As the sun lifted over the roofs of Rome, warming the broken stones of the old mint, the silence broke, not with sound, but with a shift in the soil, a subtle settling that felt like something below adjusting its weight. The bronze masks, ancient and new, seemed to lean imperceptibly toward the slab, as if acknowledging a master stepping onto the floor. The foundry of Emperor Aurelian had taken its first worker in more than 1,000 years, and in the quiet that followed, the city remembered that some empires do not die. They simply wait for the furnace to be fed again.